Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We are live from Books and Books here in Coral Gables. We're very happy to have you with us. Also with the thanks to the Knight Foundation for their generous support. Tonight we also welcome C-SPAN to our audience. To our internet audience watching, if at any time during tonight's presentation you'd like to order a copy of the book, just give us a call here at the store. We'll get a book signed for you. We'll ship it to you free of charge anywhere in the United States. For those of you here, I ask you to please silence your cell phones. You can take all the pictures you want, but don't use a flash because that'll interrupt the flow of the live streaming. You can also go to our website, booksandbooks.com. You can give us your email address. That way we can alert you to everything that goes on here at the store. You can also pick up a copy of our Books and Books newsletter on the counter. This will give you a rundown as well. You'll never be lonely with the amount of emails we send you, but that way you won't miss anything. And we also do a number of these events are live streamed. They are archived, so if you've ever missed anything, you can always go back and check the library and see what you've missed and take advantage of that as well. Today we're very happy to have with us Juliana Barbassa in conversation with Michael Dibert, Dancing with the Devil in the City of God. A self-described hybrid creature, Juliana Barbassa, award-winning journalist and former Rio de Janeiro correspondent for the Associated Press. She's lived in Iraq, Malta, Libya, Spain, France, and the United States, but her heart has always belonged to her native city of Rio. In her debut book, Dancing with the Devil in the City of God, Rio de Janeiro on the Brink, is a testament of her love, a painstakingly researched and visceral portrait of Rio's struggles to change after being catapulted into the international spotlight by the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Olympics. Michael Dibert is the author of In the Shadow of Saint Death, The Gulf Cartel and the Price of America's Drug War in Mexico, The Democratic Republic of Congo Between Hope and Despair, and Notes from the Last Testament, The Struggle for Haiti. You can also follow him on Twitter as well. Tonight's event is also presented in collaboration with the Centro Cultural Brazil. Please give them both a nice warm welcome.
Happy to be here and to be able to talk with Juliana about her book, which is really terrific. I think there are very few cities that are able to encapsulate an entire country in the popular imagination the way that Rio de Janeiro does for people's impression of Brazil. And I think there are very few books that capture a city in its entirety as well as this book does about Rio. I think what we're going to do is Juliana is going to begin by reading an excerpt, and then we're going to talk a little bit among ourselves, and then we're going to open the discussion up to the audience. So without further ado, I'll let her read a chapter from her book.
And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. This is a little section from the introduction. It started as a persistent tapping, like impatient fingers on a tabletop. Takata, 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 takata. I was on deadline, hunched over my desk in the back corner of the Associated Press newsroom in San Francisco, trying to block out the perennially ringing phones and the reporter chatter. This was October 2009. President Barack Obama's plan to reform healthcare was the news of the day, and my editors in New York wanted an article on what it meant for immigrants. I had a couple of hours to make something coherent out of the reports strewn on my desk. On my screen, sentences refused to coalesce into paragraphs. Through the office din, I heard that pulse, faint but insistent, takata, takata, takata. Then it clicked. I knew that pattern. It was a call and response of surdos, the bass drums that drive a Brazilian samba beat. The sound was so out of place in the air-conditioned newsroom that my eyes flew up to the TVs that hung in clusters from the ceiling, tuned to the news. I walked over. One of the tech writers was already there, craning his neck to watch, curious about the commotion. There was the long sweep of Copacabana Beach, the cobalt of the Atlantic. The white sand was thick with people, tens of thousands, skin glistening as men stripped off their shirts on the warm spring day, and women danced, arms wide spread, the whole crowd flashing Brazil's green and yellow colors and heaving to the syncopated beat. This was the day. Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, was in the running to host the 2016 Olympics, up against Tokyo, Madrid, and Chicago. The announcement would be broadcast live on massive screens raised on the beach. This wasn't the country's first try. It had bid 2 times before and failed. But this run was different. Brazil was different. A copy of The Economist sat on my desk under the healthcare reports, folded back to an article on vast oil finds just off Rio's shore. There had been other intriguing headlines recently. Brazil was lending money to the International Monetary Fund after years of failing to pay its debt. Its middle class had grown by a population the size of California's in less than a decade. Something remarkable was happening in the southern giant. Financial papers had picked up on it, even if to most foreigners it was still a place of poverty and parties, samba, soccer, and favelas. The country's recent good fortune and its Olympic bid made for good copy. As a journalist, I knew that. But my interest wasn't just professional. I was born in Brazil, although I'd spent most of my life rambling from country to country, first as the daughter of an oil executive and later as a reporter with a chronic case of wanderlust. Over time, the roots connecting me to my home country had grown long and thin, but I'd kept them alive through annual visits and by collecting news articles such as the ones that littered my desk. Recently, I'd noticed a change in these articles. What had been occasional pieces, mostly short briefs about a burst of violence or a presidential election, came more frequently and in greater depth. The world had begun to pay more attention to Brazil. The Olympic vote would push it right into the spotlight.
So, Juliana, one thing that I thought was really interesting about your book is that Rio, I think it's often seen a lot of times with this very carefree image, this image of the beach and samba and, caipirinhas. But your book deals very frankly with some of the problems of the city, from the violence to the environmental degradation and poverty. And I was wondering, how has the city, for so many, been able to maintain this kind of dual Janus-like image through the rest of the world, to people abroad especially? And why does it remain this very iconic image of Brazil?
Well, part of the reason why Rio has this Janus-like nature, as you said, is because it is all of those things at once. If you live there, if you've spent time there, you know it is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to, and it's a place where the physical environment imposes itself on your everyday life. You can't step out of your building without going, oh my God. When I lived there, my daily run took me past the Sugarloaf, took me along Guanabara Bay. It's astounding every time you see it. And at the same time, all of these other things that you live and you suffer if you are based there are very much true. One thing doesn't get in the way of the other. The water is there, the bay is gorgeous, and the setting sun, it's also heavily polluted. You can go for a run on the Aterro do Flamengo, where I lived, and it's beautiful, and there are flocks of parrots, and it's a picture postcard. But it's also true that if you're there after dark, you're very likely to be mugged. Those things coexist side by side, and Cariocas know that and have known that for a long time. But for some reason, outside of Brazil, there is this sort of travel agency poster image of Rio and of Brazil, as if it were a flat place, as if it were a single dimension. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it would surprise people to mention some of these complexities.
Yeah. I was recently, talking about some of the other aspects of it. I was reading recently there was an Amnesty International report that said police in Rio had killed 1,500 people in the last 5 years. And obviously that's a war that goes backwards and forwards between the kind of bandits and the favelas, so described, and the security forces, and among them themselves. Why do you think Rio is such a violent place, and do you think that's representative of Brazil as a whole, or do you think it's something that's particularly concentrated there?
I think, unfortunately, it is representative of Brazil as a whole. Rio has very particular elements that make its violence a particularly carioca, particularly Rio-based violence, including the fact that, since the early 80s, drug dealing gangs have come to dominate great swaths of the landscape. The favelas that were virtually abandoned by the state. Police couldn't go in, and these gangs controlled those spaces. But part of Rio's specific brand of violence, and I think something that it has in common with many other cities in Brazil as well, is that the police is often just another faction. You talk about the gangs, but there's also the militias, and then there's the police itself. Like you said, in the last 5 years, 1,500 people killed. This is according to the police's own estimates. This is not some NGO, wanting to call attention to every case. This is what the police itself records. But at the same time, it's crazy to imagine this is an improvement. In 2007, there were 1,330 people killed by police in Rio de Janeiro state, just in 2007. So gives you a sense of change too.
I always thought one of the most kind of illustrative things, symbols of the police's attitude towards kind of the population is the Bobe, which are kind of the special forces of the police. I mean, their official symbol is a skull with a knife through it and 2 machine guns behind it. That's what they wear on the patches of their uniform. That's not just something they came up with. So I think that tells you a lot. Mm-hmm. I was wondering, I mean, going out of that, obviously these police exist the way they do because there's some kind of understanding between the middle class and the upper class in Brazil that's how they want to be policed. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the class structure in Rio and what role that plays in the way people experience daily life who live there.
Well, the class structure in Rio and in Brazil in general, and this is going to be familiar to any of the Brazilians out there, is unlike the U.S. where there's this great amorphous sense that we are all kind of middle class. The middle class is something very broad and not specifically defined. Brazil has a very strong social hierarchy that's not only felt but also it's part of the way the government looks at society. There's Class A, Class B, C, D, and E. And so when people talk about the Brazilian middle class having grown, they're talking about a really specific segment of the population that earns between X and Y. It's measured and talked about that way. And I'm sorry, you asked them about the class structure in connection to...
No, I mean, I was just saying that, obviously the way the security forces deal with the poor is kind of because that is what the powerful in society have kind of accepted, I guess. And I was just wondering, what's the difference between, for example, if you're born into a family in Ipanema and you're born into a family in Vigário Geral?
Oh, it's all the difference in the world. For example, when people ask me, if Rio is dangerous, my answer is always, well, it depends. It is, yes, more dangerous than Coral Gables, but it's also very, very dependent on whether you are born in Vigário Geral, which is a favela that has a history and is tied to some iconic episodes of violence in a very violent city, or Ipanema. Somebody like me, I may be pickpocketed. That's the kind of violence I might be subjected to realistically. If I were a young black man born in Vigário Geral, leaving home to buy bread might mean a run-in with police, and they might misinterpret something I do, and I could end up dead. These things happen on a very regular basis in Brazil. They don't even make ripples. It's astonishing. I would love to see, for example, a study of cases of people killed in Rio de Janeiro and where they end up in the pages of the newspaper. A young black boy killed by police, it doesn't matter if he's a teenager, it will be in the back pages by the weather. Yeah. A wealthy white person such as a restaurant owner in Gávea, one of the more affluent neighborhoods in Rio, terrible story. Of course, nobody deserves to meet a violent death, but that case made front pages and remained in the front section of the newspaper for well over a week.
Why do you think these divisions, these kind of class divisions, very rigid, have persisted for so long in Rio? In Brazil as a whole, but in Rio specifically?
I mean, that's a very complex answer, but I really think it has to do a lot with, one, Brazil's legacy of slavery that was never really successful, I can't even say successfully dealt with, it was just never dealt with. Brazil's a country that still hasn't faced what that meant. And many of the inequalities that stem from that are still very much entrenched and a structural part of society. I also feel like there has never been a very significant challenge to this social structure in Brazil. There's never been a revolution. There's never been something that really shook it up. I think that's part of why when President Lula was elected a few years ago, the first working class president that Brazil ever had, it felt revolutionary to many Brazilians because nothing like this had ever happened. There was the working class basically had never seen themselves represented in power.
I read at the time when he was elected an editorial in a Brazilian newspaper that said it was comparable to the abolition of slavery, actually, someone like that being elected as president. But
Yeah.
did it turn out? How did it turn out? Did it turn out as empowering the underclass as much as people had hoped?
Well, that's also a very complex answer. Brazil's a complicated place. It's hard to reduce it to something simple. But so the simple answer is yes. Having the Workers' Party in power did mean that people who had never had access to the circles of power had access to them, and the Workers' Party also implemented some really specific programs that did a lot for the poorest, for the people who had been historically not just neglected, just shut out of resources.
Invisible.
And absolutely invisible. Just one, the most obvious example is the Bolsa Familia program, which is a transfer of wealth program that gives money, subsistence money, really. I mean, not money you can live on, but money you can, that makes a difference between hunger and not hunger, to the very poorest. That program is huge. It reaches, I believe, now 1/4 of the Brazilian population. And so those people who had never had anything now had something from their government. And that is very significant. And the growth of the middle class, all of those things, those are very real. A lot of people's quality of life really improved in the last 15 years, not only because of the Workers' Party, obviously a lot of other factors, but in part because of that. But on the other hand, as President Lula himself said at one point, not long after he was elected, it's cheap to take care of the poor. And as I said in the book, that is either cynical or just truthful, depending on where you stand. It's this Bolsa Familia program, so big, reaches such a big part of the population and made them so loyal to the Workers' Party, because for the first time they were being looked to. It also costs a tiny, tiny fraction of the GDP relative to so many other programs that lend money to big corporations, of the sort that are too big to fail, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it doesn't take very much.
Yeah. It's also telling that 1/4 of the population needed the program.
Yeah, exactly.
So your book takes a very long historical view about Rio, but it's tied obviously to the fact of the city hosting the Olympics and also the World Cup. And I was wondering, how serious was the disruption and displacement to ordinary citizens in Rio caused by holding these two monstrous events? I mean, monstrous isn't big, not necessarily evil.
Well, it was monstrous. Yeah. It was a tremendous disruption, and not all of it negative. The World Cup was, as you guys may remember, preceded by tremendous protest marches. Hundreds of thousands of Brazilians took the streets, people in Rio included. But then when the World Cup came, it was also a tremendous party. And, everybody had the day off when Brazil played. Can you imagine Rio de Janeiro, with all that about it, the beaches, the beer that you can buy from the vendor just there, giant screen set up on the beach. Everybody has the day off. It's a huge party. That's what it felt like, for an entire month, pretty much. Mm-hmm. So that's a disruption of sorts. But when we're talking about the physical landscape of the city, there's been a great restructuring of it. Between the World Cup, but even more so with the Olympics. And the people who felt it the most and who are going to continue to feel it over the next 50 years, because these are things that are going to stay with us for decades, are, again, the lowest income cariocas. A really clear example of this for me is the fact that just 2 months after Rio got the Olympics, the mayor issued a list of 119 favelas that would be removed by 2016. And to that initial list, others were added. And once I started to look into this, because it was so astonishing to me, the reason given when the names were first published, that they were in dangerous areas, or there could be mudslides there. There had been no time to do that research. If you looked at the reports, a report condemning a community could be a couple of pages long with pictures pulled out of Google. It was a very thinly veiled attempt, basically, to wipe undesirable residents off of wealthy and up and coming parts of town, essentially. And the excuses varied. depending on the community. But this was huge. I mean, this is the biggest removal of communities, removal of the poor from desirable areas that had ever taken place in my lifetime, certainly.
Yeah. I connected with that a bit. We have also heard, I mean, for decades, I guess, that, both from local authorities and from national authorities in Brazil, that they were going to clean up the environmental situation in Rio. And, now as the Olympics are kind of looming, we're hearing about the levels of bacteria in the water and whatnot. Mm-hmm. Why has that been so hard to kind of get accomplished for so many years?
Well, this is a long-standing problem.
Yeah.
First of all, the bay, unfortunately, Guanabara Bay at the heart of Rio has been the city and the state's toilet for decades. Big efforts to clean it up are also not new, and big efforts tied to big events in Rio are not new.
Yeah.
Every time the foreigners come or are coming, there's like an uproar and a desire to clean this up really quickly before everybody gets there. The last big effort before this one was after the UN Environmental Conference of 1992.
Okay.
And after that, there was this collective embarrassment over the state of the bay and the waterways, and the state government, together with international lending agencies, pooled. I'm not going to remember the exact amount of money now, but a whole lot of money to build 4 different sewage treatment plants along the bay that were supposed to really change the situation. And, those were built. The companies that were contracted to build them got the money, and they were put into place. They were eventually all inaugurated with great pomp. Mm-hmm. None of them ever worked to capacity. One of them now, I think it operates at about half capacity, something like that. The connections basically were never built. So we got the plants, we didn't get the pipes, because that was not part of that. You can't inaugurate a pipe.
It's like one of those fake towns that you can push down on a Hollywood set or something.
Yeah, but I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. And behind that, you have mismanagement of public funds, you have corruption, you have just poor planning. And it's just such a shame. And so when they said this was going to happen for the Olympics, I was very hopeful, not just as a journalist, but as somebody who really cares for the city, who lives there. My entire family lives there. They're watching me right now. So this would have been tremendous. It would have been a tremendous legacy for the population. But I honestly didn't think that they would do it, because they just haven't done it in the past, every time that they said they would. And, indeed, here we go.
Yeah. You had touched a bit on the unrest that happened in 2013, which I think took a lot of people by surprise who maybe were not following Brazilian politics so closely, and maybe even a lot of people in Brazil. The fact that there was this kind of collective upheaval. Why do you think it happened, and why do you think it happened particularly at that time?
It was a huge surprise to anyone who watched Brazil and to anyone in Brazil. There was no journalist or academic or activist who could have predicted anything like that. And I think that it had to do with the fact that we were going into the Confederations Cup, which precedes the World Cup by a year. And so there was a sense among the population, as the momentum built, as these, the first few marches started to become bigger and bigger, there was a sense that the world was watching, and it's our time to say something. But the frustration, I think, came from what I believe is a very interesting thing happening in Brazil. All this talk of the growing middle class, of the fact that the country's up and coming, the country was doing better economically. So many Brazilians who had lived month to month now had a little bit of spending money, and they were being called middle class. And I feel like they started to believe it. And being middle class means more than just being able to get a smartphone. It comes with a host of other expectations, expectations for basic services, expectations about how your tax money is going to be spent, even civil rights, expectations. And we were talking a little bit earlier about the poor and the rich, and the law in Brazil traditionally has applied only to the poor. The rich kind of live in their own sphere. And so, sorry, let me just finish. And so there was, I think that there is this greater sense of entitlement to these rights. And the posters that people were carrying when they were out in the streets were calling for transparency in government, better governance, better schools, better hospitals, less money spent on stadiums, less money spent on things that the population doesn't need. And this is right before the Confederations Cup and then before the World Cup. So now we've got the Olympics. Who knows what we've got ahead.
Do you think also that maybe it was kind of a wake-up call for the so-called middle class by the way they were treated by the security forces when they were protesting? Because they were quite brutally treated in Rio, especially, and a lot of other places too.
Yeah, Rio and Sao Paulo, the police cracked down on protesters in a way that was also really surprising. I mean, this was a series of shocks in a way that people could come out into the streets that way when the country had been doing so well for so long, better than it had in my living memory. And so, and the people are protesting now, and then that the police came after them in a way that we also hadn't seen since the protests calling for direct elections, during the military regime. And so it was so strange, this Brazil that was supposed to be arriving, that was supposed to be, sort of finding its place in the sun, on the, its moment to shine. We were seeing things that were absolutely not expected. They were not supposed to be part of the picture. And I think the government was very much caught by surprise by all that.
Yeah. And my final question before we open it up to the audience is, given all these things we've discussed, why do so many people, myself included, and you, still love Rio so much?
Yeah. I think the city is addictive. For these reasons that I was saying, it is a place of extremes. It's a place that, can charm you on a daily basis and horrify you and charm you and horrify you. And this cycle is addictive. I mean, you're guaranteed an adrenaline rush every time you step out your door, for better or for worse. And as a journalist, it's an absolutely fascinating place. There's no better story than Rio and Brazil, I think. And as a person who lives there, it's a city that engages you and infuriates you. It's like those tempestuous love-hate relationships. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, I left Rio in February of this year, February 2015, and I have moved to Zurich in Switzerland. And it's it's a lovely city. It's not addictive.
Okay. Well, with that, I think we'll open it up if the audience has any questions for Juliana.
Can I ask you something? Do you have your book in Portuguese? No.
No, not yet. No, it's only in English. Yeah.
It's gonna be translated or something like that.
I think so. I haven't looked into it yet, honestly. Since it just came out, I'll pursue that.
Thank you.
If anyone could raise their hands. There you go.
I was at the climate meeting in Rio several years ago, and as a part of that, I had the privilege of going to one of the first favelas that was cleared out. And one of the things that struck me is, two things struck me. The first one was that it was extremely effective, and that the favela was incredibly accessible in a way that many people said it had never been before. But the other thing that struck me was that the park, it was a favela built on a mountain that had a large sort of green space on top of the mountain. And the park was still occupied by a French mining company that was illegally mining the land. And so the police had actually cleared out everyone except for the giant multinational company that was occupying half of a mountain. And I really never understood, why the police would never want to take that step unless they really had some relationship with that company. I just would like to hear your reaction to that situation.
Well, that's a lot of the way that Brazil works. As we were talking, the law historically in Brazil has applied to some and not to others. Some people get, first, second, and third chances and special considerations, and others get a baton on, if they raise their head. I don't know that particular situation at all, but it doesn't surprise me that, an international company would get treated differently from favela residents, not in the least.
Yes, right there.
I totally understand your love-hate relationship because I've been to Rio 8 times. It is an addiction. But my question is, I haven't been there in 11 years, but when they got rid of these favelas, did it increase your homeless population? I mean, where did they go? These aren't people, like you said, that have a bank account that can just, oh, well, I guess I'll move to so-and-so. So what happened to them, for the most part?
Well, the government, when they cleared them out, they either offered them a certain very small amount of money to try to find somewhere else in the city, and that amount of money that was being offered was just not enough to live in the choice areas where these favelas were located. So many people moved to communities that were very far away, just on their own. And the government was also offering sort of public housing in many times in places that were ours. So these people basically spread themselves and went further to the margins, which is the way that many of Rio's poor have been treated for much of history, just pushed out to the margins. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, when there was another big favela removal program under the military, this is exactly what they did. They knocked down communities in what is now Lagoa and Ipanema, Leblon, the highest rent zip codes in Rio, and basically sent them to public housing really far away in places that are now Cidade de Deus, for example, the City of God community that you may have heard of. There's the movie and the book. That started as one of these government housing programs that is far from jobs, far from transportation. Many of the houses didn't even have running water. So the government is basically doing that same very poorly thought out plan again. Some of if you look at a map, I mentioned this in the book. I wish I had a map to show you the places from which people are being removed and the places to which they are being sent. The jobs in Rio are in the south center, the downtown and the wealthy south side. Most of the relocation, especially of the poorest, because you can actually divide it by socioeconomic strata, most of the relocation, and especially of the poorest, are to the furthest areas where there are the fewest jobs and no decent transportation. So you're taking people with the least resources and putting them in the area where they have least access. It's a disaster in the making. And this is why I say this is not something that's just happening now. This is something that we're going to live with for 40, 50, 60 years. Because 50 years later, we're going to have what we now have left over from the late 60s and early 70s, which are places where people have no opportunities and crime grows.
Can I just ask a follow-up question to that? Is this literally so that when the TV cameras sweep the hills, they don't see anything unpleasant, or is there a sort of deeper reason for these relocations?
Two reasons. First is that one. That's the simplest answer. You don't want little independently built, one brick at a time, one family at a time, houses showing up on your beautiful sweeping panoramic shot. And also real estate prices. Again, if you look at where most of these favelas that were chosen for removal are, they're in the wealthy south side and in the west side, which is the booming real estate frontier of Rio. And if you look at who owns the land in the west side, who's building the big gated communities, the west of Rio, for those who may not know, is a landscape that's completely unlike the rest of Rio. It's gated communities and malls and multi-lane highways. The rest of the city is built on a totally different, on a more pedestrian model. And so the people who own the land, and a construction company that's building there is one of the biggest landowners in that region, they don't, to say they don't benefit, they lose when there's a lower income community within view of their fancy high-end development. And so that is the longer term answer to your question. It's no coincidence, for example, that the main Olympic cluster is in the west side. This already growing, already affluent part of the city, because when you build new transportation routes to bring people to the games, you're also building more transportation routes to feed this area. When you invest there, for example, building the Olympic Park, the company that's building the Olympic Park after the Olympics are over, part of their payment is being able to build high-end residential and office developments on that land. And so, it's a process of taking from some and giving to others that is very well thought out. It's absolutely not coincidental.
As a Carioca who left in '86 but goes back every year, what's your vision for Rio within the next 5 to 10 years?
Vision as in what I hope for or what I think will happen? Gosh. I would hope for a less negative impact of these Olympics. Some of the things that came with that project are indelibly already ingrained into the landscape, and there's nothing we can do about that. But there are things that we could still hope for an improvement on. For example, the security situation. I saw the other day that the announcement that to keep Rio safe for the Olympics, they're going to deploy the biggest security operation that the city has ever seen. And I already saw this with the Pan Am Games and again with the World Cup, an increasing arming of the police. If just for fun, you guys should try to Google this. There was a photo that ran in the Rio newspaper, O Globo, of the cops' new setup that they were getting in time for the World Cup. They look like RoboCop, black Kevlar encrusted outfits, helmets with a visor, the stick and the guns and the handcuffs. And these were the people who were going to be policing Rio streets. The Olympics is a bigger event internationally, bigger event for Rio because the World Cup was spread around the country. So you can imagine when they say the biggest security operation ever, what this is going to mean. And when I think of what it'll mean for the population, I mean after the games are gone. When you take a police force that, like we were saying, has killed 1,500 people in the last 5 years, police force that remains very unaccountable. There have been some efforts at transforming the culture within the police, but they have certainly not been successful yet. Not successful enough for me to feel comfortable with them getting many more guns. So, what I hope for in that sense is that we can avoid some of that we can say work harder at transforming that police culture and not have the negative impacts that could have. What I think will happen is, unfortunately, not very pretty. Some of Rio's best hopes were hanging on the exploitation of the pre-salt fields, the oil fields, off the coast. And, if you've been following Brazil in the news, there's a massive corruption scandal unfolding now that involves the oil company, government officials, the big construction companies, including the very construction companies that are building the Olympic venues. And so, Rio was counting on the construction with the Olympics. It was counting on the oil, and it was counting on the general sort of, upward turn of the national economy to leverage itself to a different echelon. And all of those things have collapsed now. The oil company is absolutely, it's battered. The job creation that was hoped for out of that isn't necessarily happening. The construction companies are themselves deeply involved. Their executives have been jailed. The biggest construction companies, their heads are in jail right now. And the national mood, along with the national economy, has really soured. So I just don't think that for Cariocas, the next 5 years are going to be a very good time, unfortunately.
Yeah, in the back, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yes, I've never been to Brazil, so everything I know is what I've learned or observed through the media. I just remember, and this took place in Sao Paulo, but more than 30 years when I was still living in New York, I saw this film. I was reeling when I walked out Peixoto.
Oh.
And although it took place in Sao Paulo, I was just wondering, it was specifically about street children who were treated like vermin by the police, and if this is, exists throughout the country in Rio, and what outreach and social services have been developed to help these children. So
Again, unfortunately, at the end, somebody asked me to say some nice things because I'm going to have to say some bad things first. But I don't know if you know, the star of that movie, Pisciacci, was a street kid himself. He was killed. He was killed. I think he was 17. Because basically he did that movie, and nothing really came for him after that. He didn't have the structure. He ended up being killed, violent death. And other kids who were in similar situations, again, to use another movie example, there was this, I don't know if you guys may remember, in the 90s, there was another horrible incident of street children being killed by off-duty police officers in front of the Candelaria Church. One of the kids who survived that massacre was the one who years later held up this bus 174, that also became a movie. So these things, I feel like they're ghosts that literally come back to haunt us in life. That they stay with us. And I have not seen anything that remotely meets the needs of these children. And in the book, I talk about one example that, still, gives me goosebumps to remember, both because of the case itself and because it was so close. There was a moment in Brazil when petty crime, street crime, started to come back up again after years of going down, and people had, these high expectations, and I can understand that there was some frustration once, you started to have pickpockets and things like that. But one of the most nefarious things that I saw happen was that people started to take justice in their own hands. So neighborhood groups, men who worked out, in my case there in Flamengo, in the park, getting together and going after these kids who are kids, teenagers and children, and beating them up. And several of these happened around Rio and around Brazil. It's not exclusive to Rio, but there was one case that was so emblematic. And it took place just down the street from where I lived, just walking down my very same street on the path that I took every day to go running. I'd walk down my very tree-lined street with orchids, hanging off of them, cross the street, cross the aterro, and go into the park to run. And right there where I would cross, one of these young men was beaten, was stripped, and was chained to a post with a bicycle lock around his neck. And that sight of a young black body tied to a post, today I can't say it without, sorry, but I really, it was something that I never expected to see, and I hope I'll never see again.
Yes.
What fundamental changes do you see would benefit or enable improvement of the major areas of problem in Rio de Janeiro, given the context it has? It's only the second largest city of Brazil.
I'm sorry, could you ask the first part of the question? I couldn't hear it.
What do you recommend, what do you think would be major changes that would enable improvement of the major problem areas affecting Rio de Janeiro within the context or the fact that it's the second economy in Brazil?
Oh. So I don't know, maybe, I think the changes would have to be political to start with. I think we would need a government that's more representative of the needs of its people. I don't feel like the government that we have there now is doing that. The priorities that it's had, as demonstrated by, the same people who are in power now have been involved, have been a part of, Rio government in one way or another. Rio's mayor, for example, since Rio went after the Pan American Games. So they've pursued this model, of turning Rio into a stage for mega events in order to put through a certain vision of the city that definitely benefits some, doesn't benefit the majority. And so I think a break from that would be tremendously helpful. One of the huge things for me has to be reform of police culture. Like I said, I feel like the police in Rio doesn't understand what it is to police. The idea of, you have a suspect, you detain this person, You take them in, there are charges, the person's given a chance to defend themselves. The way that the police in Rio has worked and still works to a great degree in regards to the majority of the population is shoot.
Yeah.
Shoot first.
I think I told you earlier, but like I was having drinks at this place in Rio about 10 years ago, and I was sitting across from a guy who was a member of the Bobe, of the Special Forces, and he told me quite deliberately and clearly, he said, my job is to kill people. So, and I don't think that mentality has changed appreciably in the last 10 years.
Is this an opinion that you have? Because it seems like you have lived out of Brazil or Latin America for many years, but what you're saying, as I heard you, is more like a North American, United States type of law, that everybody has a chance to go in front of a judge. And I mean, I know it's not happening everywhere. I mean, every time here in the United States is failing us a lot right now. But is this something that you have felt now as you have been maybe a few years out of Brazil and working in the United States, how the Constitution works and how the law in the United States works?
Yes, to a certain degree. I'll say I'm certain I was influenced by having spent many years abroad, but I also feel like I don't change. I've at this point in my life and my career, I have the way that I do my job, and I have my expectations of a place, and I don't change them depending on the place. Every place I go, when I was here in the United States, I wrote about immigration, and I wrote very critically when I felt like the system was failing. I want to hold the government accountable to its duty towards its citizens. I would like laws to be followed. I would like for there to be due process. And I feel that way, independent of whether I'm here or in Brazil. I don't want to hold my own country to lower expectations, essentially, than those that I hold any other country. If I, cover Mexico, I would want the same things. And of course, I know the context is different, but I just don't want to, like I said, I don't want to adjust what I want for the Brazilian people based on, well, historically it's been like that. I just want to set my eyes on, I want to set my aim high and go for that.
Does anyone have one happy question for the
Yes, I have a happy
Mine
question.
can be happy. Is there any chance they could get the Dilma to resign and change? Given her connections to Petrobras and Odebrecht, the head of Odebrecht has recently been to custody. Sometimes you read editorials about there's some groups that are calling for the president to resign or to be overthrown. What is the latest on that?
Well, I actually, and not because I like Dilma, but I don't like the idea of impeachment. I don't feel like there are grounds for impeachment, and I feel like she was just elected a few months ago. The turmoil, what it would mean for the country, and what it would say about the tenor of our democracy, which I have felt has really been solidifying and maturing for many years. I would not like for us to lose that because of this moment of crisis. So I would like for it to be dealt with within the system. And again, to turn this into a positive direction, the things that are making Dilma's life so difficult right now, and making Brazil's economy sluggish isn't even the word; it's shrinking. I feel like the economic scandal, the scandal involving the corruption scandal involving the oil company and involving the government, involving the construction companies. That's a big part of what's making the economy shrink, and that what's making Dilma's popularity so low. And looking at that very same scandal, I feel there's a very positive aspect to it. The investigation by the judge who's leading it, and judges in Brazil have a lot of independence to direct and to determine the scope of an investigation. This investigation has been very serious, and it's done things that I've never seen done before, like putting the head of Odebrecht in jail and starting to name very powerful people. And I believe perhaps naming very powerful politicians. So that is something that I would like to see more of. The process happening, the way it should. The powerful being held accountable just like the non-powerful. This is something that I think is very promising in this great morass that Brazil is in right now. This investigation and the fact that people who have never been held accountable are being held accountable. And if one of those people ends up being Lula or Dilma, then great, so be it. But I don't want to see an impeachment. I don't want to see a coup, or I don't want to see anything that goes against this very solid democracy that we've built.
Obrigado. Do we still have time? One more? Yeah, okay. In the back.
How did you come about the title for the book? How did she come about the title for the book?
I was trying to find something that expressed this sense of sort of a reckless gamble that I felt Brazil was entering into, and Rio in particular was entering into when it bid for these mega events, these 3 mega events in a row. Something great could have come out of it, and certainly when Rio won the Olympic bid, most of Brazilians felt that way, that this was great, it was a sign that we were arriving, all that. But I could also see, just because of the history of the Olympics, they traditionally go over budget. In many cases in the past, they've left venues that are underused and very expensive to maintain. So I felt like it was a dangerous gamble that the government was entering into by taking on these games. And in the City of God part, it actually doesn't refer to the favela, and it doesn't refer to the community of the same name that exists in Rio. It actually refers to the fact that, for me, one of the most iconic images of Rio is the Christ statue. And from anywhere in the city, you see it. You feel like it's watching you, and it's watching at different times, of crisis or of these, certain unbelievable situations, good or bad, that I lived in the city. You'd look up and the Christ is there, sort of impassive and stone-faced. And it was something that I would start to ask myself, basically. I was like, what are you looking at? What do you have to say about this? This, depending on what the situation was. So hence the title.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you, Michael. For those of you watching online, don't forget there's still time to give us a call here at the store and order the book. For those of you here, the books are for sale behind the counter. I ask you one favor. If as you rise, you could fold your chairs so we can create some room in here. Let's give our authors another round of applause. And also, don't forget to join us outside. We got some great Brazilian music to meet tonight. Thank you very much.